long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Trey Orndorff, a political scientist at Oklahoma Christian University, and I am joined by Ken Katkin, a professor of law at Chase Law School, for our supporters exclusive Constitution Show. Ken, welcome back to the Constitution Show.
It's great to be back.
Yeah, this has been a lot of fun. If you have been a supporter for a long time, you know that we have been on a multi-year odyssey through the Constitution, the United States Constitution. And we are beginning today, and we'll probably finish today, with the 15th Amendment. And so what we always start with is as we read the amendment, we kind of talk about it, and then we get into the court cases and its historical importance. And so the 15th Amendment, it's ratified not long from where we are right now. So I guess we're on track in a way, in February 3rd of 1870. And here is it. It only has two sections. Section 1 says, quote, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude." Section 2 says, quote, "The Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation," end quote. And that is the entirety of the 15th Amendment. Now, for some context to listeners, because obviously the whole Constitution is not written at the same exact period, because we're now into these amendments at different moments, the 15th Amendment is passed during the Reconstruction era following the Civil War. And we have been covering these Reconstruction era amendments most recently, Ken and I have. They are the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments. And the idea here was that it aimed to extend voting rights to African-American men, particularly those who had been emancipated. That's the 13th Amendment. And then its passage reflected to ensure there was going to be that equality after the abolition of slavery, which was the 14th Amendment. And the 15th Amendment, at least by those who are ratifying it, was an ability to kind of cement the ability of black citizens to vote, even if they had been in a position of slavery. Now, despite the ratification of these amendments, and we have already gotten into this, and we'll get into more here in the 15th Amendment, Southern states continue to employ a lot of tactics such as literacy tests, poll taxes, grandfather clause, and other just outright intimidation forms to try to disenfranchise Black Americans. And it's not until we get to the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that many of the barriers finally get a little bit systematically dismantled. So far, that's where we're at. Now, as we've already discussed, it's not really until the 14th Amendment gets to have teeth in the 1960s that we think of it in its modern interpretations. And although the 15th Amendment was designed by former abolitionists to be the fulfillment of that promise to the Black community, it doesn't really get a lot of traction. And part of this, and this is an interesting one that we've talked about, hinted at, Americans today, we oftentimes think of voting as being this kind of centerpiece of our constitutional rights. But in fact, the original Constitution does not contain any kind of voting provision. Before Reconstruction, the idea of who could vote or that everyone could vote was a radical one. And so different states had vastly different roles on voting, including needing to hold property, on gender, race, and more. And so the 15th Amendment, you'll notice, is also a little bit tame to modern reader standards because it's not enshrining an overall complete right to vote, obviously, in the text itself. The closest that we're come, we talked about this in Article 1, Section 2, is where the people who are eligible to vote for U.S. House members are determined by what's in each state by letting what states vote for their own House of Representatives. So that's kind of far from a guarantee of a right to vote. It's really more of empowerments of states. But the 15th Amendment, even though it may have been viewed at the time as being pivotal, is going to get largely ignored for about 100 years and kind of jurisprudence. As the South imposed restrictions on votings to bring down the number of black voters, the Supreme Court in early cases holds that it really doesn't have the power to force Southern states to comply with the 15th Amendment. So Giles versus Harris in 1903 sets this in motion. James versus Bowman in 1903 sets this in motion. In Giles, effectively, the court says, look, there's no enforcement provision here, that Congress can't actually really enforce states to follow these rules. And in the Bowman case, also in 1903, the amendment says, Congress is not authorized to publish private individuals who interfere with African-American voting. And so if you can't force the state to do it, Giles, and you can't punish individuals from dealing with it in Bowman, there's not a lot of teeth to the 15th Amendment. And so until we get to more modern interpretations of the 15th Amendment, there's not a lot to be done here. Okay, so Ken, there's kind of our setup for the 15th Amendment. As a constitutional, as a lawyer, as a con law lawyer, kind of how do you approach this? What cases do you then start with?
Yeah. Well, one that I would mention, I think you sort of talked about its holding, but didn't quite go into. I'd go into slightly more detail.
Please do.
Yeah. United States versus Reese in 1876 was the very first U.S. Supreme Court decision that interpreted the 15th Amendment. And it sort of lays the groundwork for ignoring the 15th Amendment for that century that you talked about. Because what happens in the Reese case is after the 15th Amendment gets ratified in 1870 and prohibits race discrimination in voting, the way most of the South responds to that is by enacting, as part of what were then called the Black Codes and what were later called the Jim Crow laws, they enact a bunch of race-neutral restrictions on voting, but then they have grandfather clauses that exempt anyone whose grandfather voted. So they put in high poll taxes, they put in difficult literacy tests, things like that ostensibly apply to everybody without regard to race. And then they say, but if your grandfather voted, then you're exempted from having to comply with that. If your grandfather voted, you don't have to pay the poll tax. If your grandfather voted, you don't have to take the literacy test.
And that's theoretically race neutral because it's in regards to your servitude status, not your race, theoretically. Unfortunately, that brings us to the end of our ad-supported preview of the Politics Guys bonus show. So this is only for supporters, and I'd love for you to hear the rest of Ken and myself's Constitution episode. And you can do that, but you're going to do that becoming a supporter of the Politics Guys. It gets you all kinds of really cool stuff when you become a supporter. It includes things like our Discord group. But if you want to get access to that, I need you to head to patreon.com/politicsguys. Again, that's patreon.com/politicsguys. If you'd like to support us in a different way, we're also on Venmo, where we're at Politics Guys, and you can support the show through PayPal. All of those are in the support links in the show notes. You can also find them at politicsguys.com/support. But again, if you want to listen to the rest of this and every single other Constitution Show episode, you're going to have to become a supporter. It's what makes this podcast possible. Now, if you'd like to get the midweek show, but you're just not financially able to do that, please shoot us an email at mail@politicsguys.com and we can get things set up. Now, whether you're a supporter or not, we would really appreciate it if you could subscribe, rate, and review us on whatever podcast app you're listening to us right now. If you've got any questions, reach out to us at mail@politicsguys.com. We're also on Facebook and X. You'll find all of those in the show notes. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Bruce Johnson, Wilma Marino, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, and Don Oglesby. We'll be back this weekend with a full show, and I hope you'll join us then.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,